Hey guys, today's video is going to be on orchids and caring for Phalaenopsis orchids specifically. I've gotten several questions ever since I did my living room tour on how do I care for them, how do I grow orchids, and how do I keep them in the house, and all of that. I also got a question on Instagram from Breath of Fresh Air. Can you do a video on how you care for your orchids, please? So definitely, let's get into it. So first, let's start with choosing an orchid, or what to look for in choosing a healthy orchid, because when you go into the store, it may be tempting to just pick the one with the prettiest blooms, but there's a couple other factors that you want to look at when choosing a healthy orchid. So what you want to do also is, if you want it to last the longest, if you want it to bloom the longest at your home, you want to choose one that isn't quite in full bloom. You want it to still have some buds that haven't opened yet. That way you're going to get the longest blooming time when it's at your house. Next, you want to look at the leaves. You want to see healthy, bright, bold green leaves. And then for the roots, those are definitely the most important part of it. You want a healthy orchid, so what you want to look for in the roots is a lot of bright green, healthy roots. As far as price point goes, orchids or Phalaenopsis orchids in my area run anywhere from $10 to $15. Sometimes I can find them at the swap meet for $5, like the little cakey ones, like the little baby orchids, and that's a good deal too. So you just have to check in your area to find the best sort of prices, but you don't always want to go for the cheapest ones. You want to go for the ones that are the most healthy and from a good nursery. I also get questions on where to purchase orchids. There are garden centers at, the big box stores. You can go there. Some people are like, oh, I would never purchase from a big box store, but the thing is, it doesn't have to do with the store itself. It has to do with the nursery and where that store is purchasing from. So look at the nursery, not the store. I can definitely tell you that the biggest and best nursery on our island, in our area, sells to Walmart, and they also sell to Lowe's. And so I go to Walmart and find some really beautiful Phalaenopsis orchids. Also, you may be able to just Google in your area, orchid nurseries, and you might find one that's open to the public. So when it comes to choosing a pot or container for your orchid, how do you know which one is going to be the best for your orchid? Alright, pros and cons of ceramic pots. The orchid roots can actually end up fusing to the ceramic, so that's definitely a con, because when you go to repot that orchid, it can end up damaging and breaking off some of the roots, and so that's not a good thing to have happen. I know I have two of my orchids currently planted in the aeration kind of ceramic, and they have actually, some of the roots have started growing through the aeration holes. So when I go to repot that, it is going to damage some of the roots. So I won't ever plant them in those again, although they look nice. So that's a pro, is that the ceramic pots, they do look good. The plastic opaque pots that are usually black or dark green, those are fine, but you're not able to see the roots still. So you're kind of at a disadvantage because you're not able to keep an eye on the roots, and you could get root rot, and there's all kinds of things that can happen, and you might never even know it, and you wouldn't be able to catch it in time because you couldn't see the roots. My preferred container for orchids are the clear plastic pots, and I will drill extra aeration holes in those and then plant my orchid in that, and then set that pot in a decorative container or a decorative ceramic pot. And I feel that I get the best of both worlds that way, because you still get the aesthetically pleasing look and it can match your decor, and you also get the benefit of being able to pluck that little plastic container out and look and check the roots of your orchid whenever you need to. So what size pot are you going to need for your orchid? Most orchid pots run between 4 and 6 inches. They tend to be rather small because that's what orchids like. They like their roots to be kind of cocooned and fitted tightly inside the pot. So when choosing the right size for your orchid, you want to be able to fit the roots in snugly but comfortably. You shouldn't have to bend the roots at all or risk breaking them to fit them inside the pot. So when you're ready to repot your orchid, what type of growing media do you need? Do you need potting soil or what? No, you definitely do not need potting soil. You need bark. So if you think of orchids, most orchids are epiphytes, which means air plants. So they don't actually grow in the soil, in the ground. They typically grow on trees and in the bark, and their roots are wrapping around the bark of trees and branches and things. So that's how they grow in nature. So that's what you want to kind of emulate. And you can go to a garden center and they will have orchid blends, orchid bark blends, blends, and the one that I use is by Better Grow, and it has fir bark, it has charcoal, large chunky perlite, and little tiny bits of sphagnum moss. You don't want anything that has too much sphagnum moss because it holds a lot of moisture, and too much moisture will kill your orchid. It needs to be able to breathe. If you think of it how it grows in nature, up on the trees, it's getting a lot of air, its roots are out there in the air, and they're not suffocated at all. For watering, it's going to depend on your area and how cold or hot your climate is. I'm in a hot climate, and so I have to water my orchids at least 3 times a week, about every other day basically. It's really important to kind of learn to read your orchid and its needs for your particular area. I have some orchids I keep in the front of the house, which is the south facing part, and I have some orchids that I keep back here, which is the north facing part. And so even they have different needs from each other because of how hot it is. If you are in a colder climate, typically watering you will want to do maybe once or twice a week. So I've heard some people water with ice cubes. I don't recommend that. If I did that, I would definitely kill my orchids because they would not be getting enough water at all. Orchids do like a lot of water. They want to be really drenched. So every time I water, I will let the water run right through its little plastic pot, and I will let it fill up the decorative ceramic pot. And I let it sit there for about 5 minutes or so and really let that media kind of soak up some of that water, let the roots really rehydrate, and that's the best way that I found for watering my orchids. And if you are in a climate that's colder, then you can still do the same thing, you just wouldn't need to water as often. And if you're not sure if your orchid needs water or not, one way to tell is by picking up the pot. So you can kind of get to know the weight of the pot, and you can kind of feel like if it's super light, then all of the media may be dried out and it's definitely time to rewater. Or if you pick it up and it still feels a little bit weighty, then maybe it's not quite time to rewater yet. Another way to tell is by looking at the roots. The roots can tell you a lot. So a nice bright healthy green means the roots are well hydrated, and if they get a little bit silvery, you know that they're getting a little dehydrated. So that's another good way to tell. And one of the reasons that I like to let the water run through the pot is to flush out any excess buildup of salts or minerals. So it's good to flush those out every once in a while, especially if you're fertilizing often. You don't want any of that kind of building up in the media over time. Also, a quick tip, if you have just repotted your orchid and it's in fresh media, that fresh bark will not retain water and moisture the same as older bark. So you want to make sure that you soak it really well. So that's another reason that I like to just let the pot sit in the water for, several minutes and let it just really kind of start soaking up that moisture and soaking up that water. Another quick tip for watering is to try to avoid getting any water into the crown of the plant or into the leaves. And if you do, just blot it up with a napkin or something, because you don't want standing water in there. It can cause crown rot later on. Since Phalaenopsis orchids are heavy feeders, I like to fertilize them with a water-soluble fertilizer once a week. So I'll just take a quarter strength of the recommended amount of fertilizer and just add that into their watering can and then water them just like normal. And if you're not sure how much fertilizer to use, it's always better to err on the side of a little less than too much. You don't want to over-fertilize your orchid because you can burn the roots if you have too high a concentration of fertilizer. When it comes to choosing which fertilizer to use, I have one that is more focused for blooms and one that's more focused on green growth. So the fertilizers that have the higher first number, that first number is the nitrogen. So with the higher first number or higher concentrate of nitrogen, that's going to focus on the green growth, which is the roots and the leaves. The second fertilizer I use, the one that's for the blooming, has a higher second number, which is phosphorus, and that helps the plant focus its energy on producing blooms and buds. So when it comes to lighting, Phalaenopsis orchids like bright shade. So if you think of like indirect lighting, if you have a bright room, like I grow some of my orchids in this room, it's full of windows, but the sun never actually shines directly in on them. If you're not sure if your orchid is getting enough light or you think it might be getting too much light, then a good way to tell is to just look at the leaves. The leaves will tell you a lot. So if they're dark green, like a very dark green, they may not be getting enough light. And if they're very light green, then it may be getting too much light, or it may be in too bright of a light. And also, when you take your orchid to water it, when you set it back in its place, set it the same direction, especially if it's blooming. Otherwise, some of its blossoms may kind of turn wonky and they will face the light. So if you set it backwards, you know, in its place, then it may end up twisted, or some of the leaves can get twisted. And so if you just kind of keep it consistent, always facing the same direction, then it will grow in a nice kind of orderly manner, I guess. Sometimes the leaves of your orchids will need a little care and attention too. So one thing that I like to do is when I first purchase an orchid, I will clean off its leaves. And so I'll use a solution of a little squeeze of lemon juice into distilled water, because when you first purchase an orchid, it may have been sprayed all over the place, all over its leaves and everything, and it may have little kind of salty water spots all over its leaves. So you want to clean those off and get them pretty and shiny again, and so the lemon juice will remove that really easily. And then I use distilled water instead of regular tap water, once again because I want it to be pure. I don't want it to be leaving any of those mineral or salt deposits back onto the leaves. So I'll just dip a little cotton pad into that mixture and just gently wipe the leaves, just the top of the leaves, not the bottom. And on occasion you may have a leaf that you need to remove. Maybe it's dying, or it's yellowing, or it's damaged in some way and it just doesn't look pretty and you don't want it on the orchid anymore. You can remove it by taking a pair of pruning scissors, cleaning them off, disinfecting them with alcohol, or you can sterilize them if you want to flame them. I usually don't actually do that. I usually just use alcohol and disinfect them, and that's worked okay for me so far. And so I'll disinfect the scissors and I'll snip it off right close to the base, as close as possible, and then I will use a little bit of hydrogen peroxide on a Q-tip and just kind of clean up that kind of open wound, because if you think of it, like plants are very susceptible to infections just like humans are. So if there's an open wound on them, they can get a fungal infection or something like that, and so you want to make sure you keep that wound clean. And then something else you can do if you want is to help the wound dry up and kind of seal off sooner, is use a tiny bit of cinnamon. Don't get the cinnamon on any other part of the plant, just take a tiny bit on a Q-tip, dab it onto the open wound, and that'll help seal it and close up that wound really quickly. So the best time to repot an orchid is after it gets done blooming. So its whole blooming cycle is done, the flowers have dropped, that's when you would want to repot your orchid. And I like to repot mine once a year. Some people say once every 2 years. It's up to you. It's up to how the media has stood up in that amount of time. If you notice that it's starting to decompose quite a bit, if it's kind of mushy when you go to press some of the bark, if it's too spongy, if it's holding too much water, it can actually become toxic to your orchid if it's decomposed too much. So that's why you need to repot your orchid regularly. Other times that you would want to repot an orchid is if you get a new orchid and it is not in bloom. It's a good idea to repot that orchid and get it into fresh media, because you don't know how long it's been in that old media. And then if you have an orchid that you've just purchased that is in full bloom, but you realize that there's some sort of problem going on, if there's a pest in the media, you know, snails or mites or something, and you feel that the roots need to be cleaned, or if you notice that the media has broken down too much and it is decomposing, its health is going to decline if you don't repot it. So those are the times that you would also want to repot your orchid. So when it comes to the actual process of repotting, I like to remove all of the bark media, all of the old media, make sure the roots are as clean from it as possible. I will also rehydrate it. I'll put it in a container of water while I'm kind of prepping the next container, the next set of media for it, and let it rehydrate. And then I'll also clip off any of those old roots. If you feel a root that's like mushy or brown or any little bit of black on it, just give it a little press, just kind of squeeze it a little, and if it's firm, then it's still alive. If it's not, if it's kind of mushy, then you can go in and just clip off that root and remove it entirely, because it may have already rotted or suffocated or whatever it may be. So you don't need to keep on any like dead parts of the roots. You only want the healthy green ones. Okay, so you purchased a beautiful Phalaenopsis in the store. It was in full bloom, it bloomed in your home, it's now done, it's dropped its flowers, and now you have this stick poking out of the plant. What do you do with this flower spike, this old flower spike? Is it gonna bloom again? Do you cut it? Do you leave it? The first option is you can cut it at the base and let the plant focus its energy into the green growth now, which is what it naturally wants to do. After it's done blooming, it wants to focus on growing new leaves and new roots. I will just take my pair of pruning scissors disinfect them with alcohol, or you can flame them and sterilize them. I'll just cut right at the base and just cut at an angle, and then just clean the wound once again with a little bit of hydrogen peroxide. Your second option is to leave the flower spike and hope for another bloom. So it's not going to bloom the same way as before though. It'll usually bloom in the way of a little side shoot or a secondary bloom. The secondary bloom is never as full, or it doesn't have as many blossoms as the initial bloom on that flower spike. So it's going to be a little smaller, flowers might be a little smaller, and it's going to be a little less impressive than the first bloom. Your third option is to leave the flower spike and hope for a keiki, which is a baby orchid. Basically, your plant will have a baby orchid kind of sprouting leaves on the side of its flower spike. So that's another option, but that's kind of a hit and miss kind of thing. You never know when it's actually going to do that unless you use keiki paste, which is a whole nother video entirely. So if you guys want to see that, maybe we'll do some experiments with that in the future. Alright guys, so hopefully I answered most of your questions. I know this probably seems like a lot of information to take in if you're just getting into orchids, but they're really very easy plants to care for once you just know their basic needs, and they're really fun to grow, and they look gorgeous in your home. So they're actually one of my favorite pieces of like home decor. Alright, so I'm gonna let you go. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video helpful, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.